Hey everyone, I'm making this recording to help you walk through Activity 3, generating spirograms and collecting data for Lab 10. So I know Lab 10 was challenging for a lot of folks, and I just want to say that off the bat, it was already challenging, and then transitioning immediately to online instruction was even harder. And then on top of that, we had to really rework an activity that already has a lot of math, and then also we're kind of shifting where we were getting the data from and the way it was presented. So I recognize that that was challenging for a lot of folks, but I also want to remind you that you had an extra week to do this, in part so that you had time to talk to one another, make an appointment with me if office hours didn't work for you, or just click that personal meeting ID button to have office hours with me, basically like FaceTiming me so that I could walk you through it. So really no one took me up on that. A few of you emailed me kind of last minute, and it was very challenging for me to set aside the actual proper time to walk you through it. So again, I really need you to put that effort in, reach out to me if I am able to properly help you. So I don't want to spend too much time calling you out, but it was really frustrating on my end to know that you were struggling and to not be in a position where you were coming to me for help or taking me up on the offer of help. Some of you made appointments and then didn't show up for those office hours. So it was just kind of hard for me, and I just want to be honest about that. But I know this was hard, so I made this resource, I took the time to do this, and I really hope that you're going to take the time to listen to it and go through it with me. So I encourage you, as you're going through this, as the video is playing, to have that lab out in front of you, maybe print it out if you have that option, or have some scratch paper in front of you so that you can take notes and see how I'm working through these problems. I'm posting the answer key for the full lab separately. This is really just for Activity 3. So the original instructions for Activity 3 were to measure tidal volume, TV, expiratory reserve volume, ERV, and vital capacity, VC, before exercise. So that's just normal breathing. Because we were not able to generate a spirogram ourselves using desktop spirometry, we got these numbers from the normal spirogram in Activity 2. We also were going to measure those specific volumes and capacities after exercise and record those values. We had a heavy exercise spirogram for Activity 2 as well. So that heavy exercise spirogram could be used to solve this problem. Some of those values that we were going to have to end up calculating after we got TV, ERV, and VC were also labeled on the graph. So we don't necessarily need to go through and do the calculations, but I'm still going to show you the formulas, and I'll show you how to get those values from the spirogram. So I wanted to kind of walk us through what those spirograms looked like in Activity 2, remind you of some of the resources you had from Activity 1, and then work our way through Activity 3, because all of it built on each other. So this was the normal spirogram from Activity 2. This was also what our spirogram would have looked like if we had done that desktop spirometry before exercise, because before you exercise, you're just breathing normally, presumably. So we see that tidal volume. The way that this is read is that we have kind of like a unit time on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have our volume of air in milliliters, so mLs. So different parts of this graph represent different instructions. Breathing in as much as possible is shown by that IRV bracket, and I'll just kind of point that out to you. So right here, we have that inspiratory reserve volume. The difference from this tidal volume peak up to the peak of inspiratory reserve volume is that excess air that we're able to breathe in, that we're able to inhale. And so I'm going to start kind of indicating to you that you should be looking at those numbers that are on the y-axis that kind of correspond with those different points on the spirogram. And these spirograms were a lot simpler to use than the ones we would have generated for a couple of reasons. One, because these are samples, and so they have pretty even recordings where it's like not 752 mils, it's 750, it's 6,000. They're very even numbers. And also everything is already labeled for you. So it's really just a matter of figuring out the volumes of stuff that is already labeled for you. So we see the kind of nice tidal volume right here, that just normal quiet breathing. The tidal volume is indicated by the difference between the lowest point and highest point there. We have inspiratory reserve volume here, expiratory reserve volume down here. They even label stuff like residual volume for you that usually you have to use very complex formulas to calculate. This was the heavy exercise spirogram. One thing that you might have noticed on the previous slide is that a respiratory cycle takes about 5 seconds to complete, whereas here it takes a little over 1 second to complete. So you have breathing happening much more quickly. You also have it kind of taking up more volume with just normal breathing. So the tidal volume becomes a lot higher. Because you don't fundamentally change your total lung capacity or your residual volume, the kind of excess air that can be inhaled or exhaled beyond tidal volume becomes much smaller, and then your tidal volume in general is much bigger. So we see a kind of increased depth of breathing as well as an increased rate of breathing. So this was a heavy exercise spirogram. This represents what our spirogram would look like if we were to do activity 3 the way it was supposed to be done and do exercise and then do spirometry. So in activity 2, you were asked to roughly compare these. We just said that we have a faster respiration rate and more depth of breathing after heavy exercise. And next to each other, you can see that quite clearly. In activity 1, you were also asked to review different lung volumes and capacities. By looking at those, you can actually get formulas. And by formulas, we just mean what combinations do you have of volume to get capacity, and how do you solve for a volume if you have a capacity and another volume. So for example, when you add different volumes together, you get capacities. Inspiratory capacity, or IC, is equal to the inspiratory reserve volume and the tidal volume. So if we look over here, we see these lines match up. This inspiratory capacity is equal to inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume right here. So that means that whatever your IRV is and whatever your TV is, when you get those numbers, you can add them together to get inspiratory capacity. Functional residual capacity is ERV plus RV. Vital capacity is IRV plus TV plus ERV. The total lung capacity is that vital capacity, so all 3 of those numbers, plus RV. So that was one of the group quiz questions, and I think several people missed it. So really review these formulas and think about what they're telling you. And if you're working through this and you struggled on activity 3, you should probably be writing down all of these formulas right now. Pause this video if you haven't and make sure you have them written down. If you have a capacity already and you have a volume that contributes to that capacity, you can solve for the other volume. So for example, inspiratory reserve volume is equal to inspiratory capacity, IC, minus tidal volume, TV. So this is just kind of, I know that it seems kind of weird to take this like diagram with a bunch of colored boxes and make mathematical expressions out of them, but math is really just problem solving. And when we see it on an activity, we don't get stuck by it, we don't get overwhelmed, we just kind of think about what we're being told and solve the puzzle. So this is how we're going to solve that puzzle for activity 3. Okay, so I'm going to kind of walk us through each table one at a time. The first thing that I wanted to point out is in this first table, this is the data collection raw results at rest. This looks a little bit different than the one on your worksheet because we don't have multiple readings. We don't have to do many readings because we're not actually doing the activity, so we're not trying to account for variability. We're just putting our data directly into the average column. If you did this in the first reading column, that's totally fine too. All you're doing is just showing we only have one value for each of these. So for tidal volume for at rest, you should have gotten 500 mils. Expiratory reserve volume is 1500 mils, and vital capacity is 5000 mils. So some of you might already kind of see some of those already. I'm going to show you exactly how to calculate tidal volume, and then we'll come back to this slide. So if we're zooming in on tidal volume, and we see that little wave of eupnea or quiet breathing, we see that the peak is at 3000 mils, and the base, the bottom of it, is at 2500 mils. So the volumes and some of those capacities are marked for you on the spirogram. Here we're looking at tidal volume specifically. Tidal volume is not 3000, it's not the peak. Tidal volume is showing you just a little bracket of this. So just from here down to here is tidal volume. So that's 3000 minus 2500, the difference between the two. So it's the difference between the highest point, the highest volume in your lungs, and then the lowest point, the lowest volume of your lungs during eupnea or regular breathing. So here, tidal volume is equal to 3000 minus 2500. It's equal to 500 mils. So we're going to repeat this for the other values. We already got that 500. Now for expiratory reserve volume right here, it's going to be 2500 minus down here 1000, and that's how we get that 1500. For vital capacity, it's this thing right here. This F stands for functional, so it says functional vital capacity. Here we're just saying vital capacity. So again, right here, 6000. I should maybe do this in a different color. Sorry about that. Minus 1000. And that's how we get that 5000 mils right there. So that's how we're able to solve this first table. We're going to do the exact same thing for the next part of the table. So right here, data collection, raw results after exercise, that tidal volume I kind of rounded this, so I think I did 5500 minus about 2000 to get 3500 right there. Some of you may not have rounded. It's okay to estimate. If your numbers are a little bit off, that's totally fine. For expiratory reserve volume, I figured that was about 1750 minus 1000, because right here lines up with 1000, and that's how we get the 750, because 1750 minus 1000 is 750. And then for the vital capacity, that's going to be basically the peak of IRV minus the base of ERV. So right here, that's going to be 6000 minus 1000 equals 5000 again. So that is not changing as a result of heavy exercise. That's limited by kind of like the size of your lungs, the size of your thoracic cavity, your residual volume, so there's limitations there. Vital capacity and residual volume are not flexible. Total lung capacity is not flexible. It's all of these other volumes and capacities that change when you're going through a breathing cycle. So as we get to the calculations, it's really just a matter of plug and chug. You have those formulas from the spirogram in activity 1, where everything was labeled and you can see what combinations of volumes get you certain capacities and what volumes to take away from capacities to solve for other volumes. So IRV, inspiratory reserve volume, is equal to vital capacity minus expiratory reserve volume minus tidal volume. VC, ERV, and TV are all things that we solved in the previous table. So for the at-rest one, that's the normal spirogram, it's 5,000 minus 1,500 minus 500 equals 3,000. For the IRV after exercise, that's the heavy exercise values that we solved on the previous slide. That's 5,000 minus 750 minus 3,500, it's 750. For inspiratory capacity, IC is equal to IRV plus TV. Now we have IRV and TV at rest and after exercise. So at rest, it's 3,000 plus 500, 3,500. After exercise, for the heavy exercise, it's 750 plus 3,500 equals 4. That's a typo. Let me fix that really fast. I fixed that on the key and I fixed it in a few other places. This should be 4,250. So when we were trying to calculate residual volume originally, we were going to have to use really complex formulas that take into account the subject's height, age, and anatomical sex. So that is just kind of grounded in your existing anatomy and physiology. It's not quite as flexible as changing before and after exercise. It remains very constant. But when we look at these spirograms, we see that they actually labeled that for us on these sample spirograms. So we see that here we have the residual volume labeled on the normal spirogram. Down here, it's labeled in the heavy exercise spirogram. So we can see that both for the normal RV and after exercise, so at rest and after exercise, it's 1,000 mils, which means we can skip the calculations completely. Originally, I told you to just assume that it was a male, maybe assume that they were 30 years old and look up the average height of someone in the United States. If you did that, it's great. You got the practice for doing that and now you understand it a little bit better. If you didn't, or if you would just want a shortcut next time, you can see that RV is labeled on the spirograms. So again, the amount of air that's in your alveoli to prevent collapse, that residual volume, remains constant regardless of whether you're at rest or during or after exercise. So then for the calculations for part C, again, we have ERV and RV. We can add those together to get functional residual capacity at rest and after exercise. Again, it's just plug and chug. So 1,500 plus 1,000 is 2,500. 750 plus 1,000 is 1,750. Total lung capacity is that inspiratory capacity plus functional residual capacity. The reason for that is IC is equal to inspiratory reserve volume and tidal volume. Functional residual capacity is expiratory reserve volume and residual volume. So that's all 4 volumes that we take into account. Adding them together gets total lung capacity. So that's 6,000 at rest. It's also 6,000 after exercise. We already talked about that, how that's really grounded in your thoracic cavity size, your lung size, your residual volume. That does not change before and after exercise. So then this last table, this last calculations table for part B, is really just collecting all of the things that we calculated in the previous tables and putting them in one spot. In your worksheet, you only had a table for the a column for the measurement, a column at rest, and a column after exercise. That change in volume 1 is one that I added to do the analysis and see that as we exercise, tidal volume increases, IRV decreases, ERV decreases, residual volume remains constant, IC increases, FRC decreases, vital capacity remains the same, and total lung capacity remains the same. So as we're drawing conclusions, some of the broad things that we can say are similar to what we said in activity 2. More air is regularly being drawn in and out. The tidal volume no longer represents eupnea or quiet breathing. It's a little bit more labored. The total capacity of the lungs can't change, but the volume that you inhale and exhale with each respiratory cycle becomes higher. Why did the tidal volume change during exercise? Because you're no longer breathing quietly. It's heavy breathing, it's labored, it uses more muscles, and also your respiratory centers are receiving a lot of signals from some of those chemoreceptors. You have a lot of production of carbon dioxide, you have heat, you have that carbon dioxide mixing with water to form an acid and changing the pH and having increased proton concentration. All of that is telling the respiratory centers, hey, get rid of carbon dioxide, and eventually we need oxygen. So you're breathing deeper, you're inhaling and exhaling more, higher volumes, and you're also increasing your rate of respiration, you're breathing more often to get rid of that carbon dioxide, and then if you're not able to do that, eventually to take on oxygen too. So this last question was really just what those arrows were telling us, explain how the various lung volumes and capacities changed with exercise. It increased tidal volume, decreased inspiratory reserve volume, decreased expiratory reserve volume, increased inspiratory capacity, decreased functional residual capacity, and maintained everything else. So hopefully this makes a little bit more sense now that you've seen how everything was calculated. This took about 20 minutes for me to kind of sit down and explain it all in one go, but I think that if you guys had asked me for help, we could have problem solved and tweaked just a couple things by looking at your data and your problems and me kind of adding to that. We could have fixed it in about 5 minutes. So if you're ever struggling for more than 2 days with something, please reach out to help. Or reach out for help. Don't wait until the last minute. It doesn't take me that long to help you figure things out. So please make sure that you're checking in with me, that you're not just sitting there getting frustrated. All of the stuff that you need is there, but sometimes you just need a little bit of direction to put it all together. So in the future, please make sure that you do that.